For 174 years, the largest gunmaker in America was the American government itself. It owned the factory, it owned the machines, it owned the patents, and it owned the men. It had no shareholders and no profit, and no competitor it could not simply outlast, because it was also its only customer. The people who ran it were not entrepreneurs, they were not executives, they were not businessmen. They were federal employees who reported to the Secretary of War. This one office armed the United States from the flintlock musket to the Cold War battle rifle. Every standard-issue long arm the American soldier carried, for 4 generations, came out of the same town in western Massachusetts, and it did something no private company had done first. It invented the way America builds everything else. Interchangeable parts. The assembly line before the assembly line. The manufacturing method Henry Ford would borrow 80 years later to build the Model T. That method was perfected inside these walls, on government time, to make government guns. And then, in the span of 4 months, a single Secretary of Defense with a cost study decided the country did not need it anymore, and shut it down. 2,275 people lost their jobs. 6 years later, a family that had nothing to do with any of it took the name. Today, that name is a private company that does more than $200 million a year. The institution that made the name worth taking is a museum. This is the story of how the United States government built the most important arms manufacturer in American history, what it made, what it cost, and why the only thing that survived the shutdown was the name on the door. Chapter 1. The arsenal they tried to storm. The first people to attack Springfield were not the British. They were farmers from the same state. In January of 1787, a column of roughly 1,500 men marched through the snow toward the arsenal on the hill above the town of Springfield, Massachusetts. They were led by a former Continental Army captain named Daniel Shays, a man who had fought at Bunker Hill in Saratoga and come home to a tax bill he could not pay. Behind him were other veterans, farmers, and debtors, and what they wanted was inside the arsenal. The muskets, the powder, and the shot the Continental Congress had stored there since 1777. They never got in. The men guarding the stockpile fired a cannon into the advancing column. 4 of Shays' men were killed. The rest broke and scattered into the frozen countryside, and the rebellion that carried Shays' name collapsed over the following weeks. But the fact of it did not collapse. The fact of it traveled. Word that armed citizens had marched on a federal weapons store and that the young Confederation had almost been unable to stop them reached the men who were about to write a constitution. It hardened their conviction that the country needed a stronger central government, one with the power to keep an arsenal and the means to defend it. The place they had tried to seize would, within a few years, become the property of exactly the kind of government its attackers had feared. The timing is not a coincidence, and it is worth drawing the line explicitly. Shays' rebellion unfolded across the winter of 1786 and 1787. The Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The men who gathered there, Washington and Madison and the rest, did so under the fresh impression that the existing Confederation was too weak to keep order, that armed citizens could march on a federal weapons store and the government could barely muster a response. The rebellion became a standing argument for a stronger union, a central government with the power to tax, to raise force, and to hold arsenals it could actually defend. The Constitution, they wrote, created exactly such a government. And one of the first things that government did, once it existed, was to formalize national armories, turning the very stockpile that Shays had tried to seize into a permanent federal institution. The arsenal the rebels had assaulted helped call into being the government that would own it. There is a tidy circularity in that, and it sets the pattern for everything to follow. An institution shaped, again and again, by the arguments of the people who opposed it. That government arrived in 1794. On the 2nd of April, Congress passed an act establishing national armories, and President George Washington signed it. Springfield was chosen as the first. The site had already proved its worth as a storage depot under General Henry Knox during the Revolution, and its geography was the argument. It sat on high ground above the Connecticut River, far enough inland that no enemy warship could sail up and shell it, close enough to water and timber and iron to actually build things. Congress appropriated the money to begin. The figures that survive put the early federal commitment at roughly $81,000, a serious sum for a treasury that had almost none. And in committing it, the government made a decision that would define the next century and a half. It decided it would not buy its weapons. It would make them. That decision deserves to be named plainly, because everything else grows out of it. In 1794, the obvious way to arm a country was to buy guns from the people who already knew how to make them, and the people who already knew how to make them were in Europe. France, Britain, the German states. A young republic, short of cash and short of skilled gunsmiths, could have signed contracts and imported everything it needed. Buying was faster. Buying was cheaper. at first. Buying required no factory, no machines, no payroll, no decades of learning. The government chose the other road anyway. It chose to own the means of production, to build the factory and hire the men and absorb the cost of learning how, so that it would never again depend on a foreign supplier to defend itself. That was not a modest choice. It was the most expensive form of independence a nation can buy, and once made, it could not easily be unmade. A factory is not a contract. It cannot be canceled at the end of the quarter. It helps to understand why, Springfield specifically, because the choice was not sentimental. The site had three things: a manufacturer needs and a fortress wants. It had water, the Connecticut River and its tributaries, which, in an age before steam, meant power, the falling water that would turn the wheels, that would drive the machinery. It had position, a location central to the New England states that had supplied so much of the Revolution's manpower, with roads and river access to move raw material in and finished arms out. And it had safety, the thing Henry Knox and Washington had prized when they first used it as a depot in 1777. That high ground set back from the coast where no enemy fleet could bring its guns to bear. A private manufacturer choosing a factory site weighs power, transport, and labor. The government weighed those too, and then added the one factor a private firm never has to, which is whether the enemy can burn it. Springfield answered every question. That is why it was first. And the money, by the standard of the moment, was real. The early federal commitment to stand the Armory up ran to roughly $81,000, a serious appropriation from a treasury that was still, in the 1790s, figuring out how to fund a government at all. That figure is worth pausing on, because it is the price tag on the make-not-buy decision, the down payment on self-sufficiency. It bought no immediate advantage. A country that spent the same money buying finished muskets from France would have had guns in hand far sooner. What the $81,000 bought instead was the beginning of a capability, the slow, expensive process of learning to make the thing rather than merely owning it. Capability is the most patient investment there is. It pays nothing for years, and then it pays everything. There was only one problem with the plan. In 1794, almost no one at Springfield actually knew how to manufacture a military musket at scale. The commitment had been made before the competence existed. The government had bought a factory in principle, and now had to discover, one part at a time, how to fill it. What it produced in those first years would be crude, slow, and wildly expensive per unit. It would also be the beginning of the only arms empire the United States would ever own outright. Chapter 2. 245 a month. The first weapon the United States built for itself was a copy. When Springfield's workmen finally began turning out muskets in 1795, they did not invent a new one. They copied the French. The pattern they chose was the Charleville musket of 1766, the same weapon France had shipped to the American cause by the tens of thousands during the Revolution, the gun the Continental Army already knew. It was a smoothbore flintlock, .69 caliber, with a barrel just over 44 inches long. Copying it was the correct decision, and it was a business decision, not a patriotic one. The Charleville was proven. Its parts were understood. Most of the muskets already in American hands were Charlevilles or close relatives, so building more of the same meant one pattern, one set of spare parts, one manual of arms across the whole force. There was no reason to gamble on originality when the job was simply to arm a country. Invention was risk. Imitation was supply. There was a second, colder logic to copying the Charleville, and it had to do with the men, not the gun. A workforce that has never built a musket cannot be handed a blank sheet and told to innovate. It has to be taught, part by part, and the fastest way to teach it is to put a known, finished example in front of it and say, make this, exactly this, again and again. A proven pattern is a training manual as much as a weapon. By choosing the Charleville, the Armory gave its new armorers a fixed target to learn against, standardized the tools and jigs they would need, and removed the endless disputes that original design invites. The first superintendents, among them John Bryant in the earliest years, were not being asked to be inventors. They were being asked to be teachers of a trade, building a workforce and a body of knowledge from almost nothing. Copying was how they did it. A thing cannot be mass-produced until it has first been produced at all, and the trade is learned fastest by copying something that already works. The output, in those first years, was almost comically small. The Armory began with roughly 40 workers, and in its first year of real production it made about 245 muskets. Not 245,000, 245. By 1798, 4 years after the founding, cumulative production had reached 3,152 muskets. These were not the numbers of an industrial power. They were the numbers of a large workshop, a few hundred guns a year, each one assembled largely by hand. But the trend line bent upward. As the War of 1812 approached and then arrived, the pace climbed to 4,000 or 5,000 muskets a year, and the workforce passed 100 men. By the time the Model 1795 pattern was finally retired, around 1815, Springfield had produced somewhere between 80 and 85,000 of them. The apprentice had learned the trade. The War of 1812 was the first real test of the whole gamble, and it is where the decision to build rather than buy began, tentatively, to pay. When war with Britain came, the United States could not exactly send to Europe for muskets in the middle of a naval conflict with the world's greatest sea power. The domestic capability it had spent nearly 20 years and a great deal of money to build was suddenly the only capability it had, and Springfield rose to meet the moment as far as its still modest size allowed, pushing output to several thousand muskets a year and expanding its workforce past 100 men. It was not a flood on the scale of later wars, but it was proof of concept. A country cut off from foreign suppliers still had a source of arms it controlled completely, and that source could be pushed harder when the need arose. The $81,000 and the years of unprofitable learning had bought a thing that could not be bought in an emergency at any price. A factory that was already there, already staffed, already knowing how, when, the ships stopped coming. But there was a flaw buried inside every one of those muskets, and it was not a flaw of quality, it was a flaw of system. Each gun was, in effect, unique. The lock of one musket would not necessarily fit the lock of the next. The parts were filed and fitted by hand, by different men with different tools, and a component made for one weapon might not drop into another without more filing. On a workbench in peacetime, that hardly mattered. On a battlefield, it mattered enormously. If a soldier's musket broke, the broken part could not simply be swapped for a spare pulled from a crate. There were no true spares, only parts that fit the gun they were made for. A weapon disabled by a single cracked component was, very often, a weapon lost. The Armory had learned to make guns. It had not yet learned to make them the same. Consider what a single musket actually cost in that first era, and the make-not-buy gamble comes into sharper focus. A hand-built weapon, assembled by skilled armorers filing parts to fit, is an expensive object. In the earliest years, when 40 men produced a couple hundred muskets across a year, the cost per weapon was high, far higher per unit than a mature private manufacturer buying in volume might have achieved. The government was, in effect, paying a premium to make its own guns badly and slowly while it learned. This is the hidden clause in every decision to build capability rather than buy product. For a stretch of years, sometimes a long stretch, the thing being built costs more and works worse than the thing that could have been bought. The Armory's early muskets were proof of the price. They were also proof that the government was willing to pay it, year after unprofitable year. Because the point was never the muskets. The point was the factory that would still be standing when the next war came, and the war after that. The scale of the flaw is easy to underestimate from a distance, so make it concrete. An army in the field does not carry a gunsmith and a full machine shop for every company of men. It carries crates of spare parts, and the assumption that a part from a crate will fit a gun in a soldier's hands. In 1800, that assumption was false for every musket Springfield had ever made. A lock spring that failed meant the weapon went back to an armorer who would file a new spring to fit that specific lock, if there was an armorer and time to do it. Multiply one broken part by an army of tens of thousands across a long campaign, and the hand-fitted musket reveals itself as a logistical liability disguised as a working weapon. Each gun worked. The system of guns did not. That distinction, between a product that functions and a system that scales, is the difference between a workshop and an industry, and Springfield had not yet crossed it. The crossing would take another generation, and a change in how the Armory thought about the very idea of a part. The government understood there was a quality problem, even before it fully understood the deeper one. As early as 1799, the Armory began requiring that muskets be marked to identify who had made them, an early form of accountability, a way to trace a bad weapon back to a bad workman. It was a sensible instinct. But marking a gun identifies who to blame after it fails. It does not make the next gun's parts fit the last one's. The real answer would be larger, stranger, and more valuable than any musket. It would not be a better gun at all. It would be a better way of making guns. One where every part was identical to every other, where a barrel from a bin would fit any lock in the building. The idea did not exist yet in any workable form anywhere in the world. It would be built here, over the next 30 years, and it would eventually escape these walls and remake the entire American economy. That was the invention that mattered. The muskets were only the excuse. Chapter 3. The machine that built the machine. The most important thing ever made at Springfield was not a weapon. It was a way of thinking about parts. In 1815, a new superintendent named Roswell Lee took charge of the Armory, and Lee was, in the language of a later century, an operations man. He did not care about any single beautiful musket. He cared about consistency, about repeatability, about turning a shop full of skilled craftsmen into a system that did not depend on any one craftsman's hand. Under Lee, Springfield began building its guns to gauges. A gauge is not a tool that shapes metal. It is a tool that checks it, a physical standard that says a part is either within tolerance or it is scrap. Every barrel, every lock plate, every screw was measured against the same master pattern, so that a component made on Monday by one man would match a component made on Friday by another. By the mid-1820s, the Armory had broken the manufacture of a flintlock musket into well over 100 separate, standardized operations. The gun was no longer the product of a gunsmith. It was the product of a process. The scale of the reorganization was staggering for its time. By the mid-1820s, the making of a single musket had been divided into well over 190 distinct operations, each one a specialized step performed with a specialized tool, many of them driven by the water power of the river rather than by a man's arm. A worker no longer made a musket. A worker made a cut. One cut, the same cut, all day, on part after part, each checked against the gauge. This is the division of labor carried to an extreme the world had not seen, and it inverted the old relationship between skill and product. In the craftsman's shop, the quality of the gun depended on the skill of the man. In Lee's armory, the quality of the gun depended on the precision of the system, and the system could be run by workers of ordinary skill because the machines and the gauges held the standard. That was the revolution hiding inside the tedium. Skill had been moved out of the worker's hands and built into the tooling, where it could be copied, scaled, and never quit for a better job. Into this system, in 1819, walked an inventor named Thomas Blanchard. Blanchard's problem was the gun stock, the shaped wooden body of the musket, an irregular, curving thing that had always been carved by hand because no ordinary lathe could turn an asymmetrical shape. A lathe spins a piece of wood and cuts it round. A gun stock is not round. Blanchard built a lathe that could trace the contours of a master pattern and reproduce them in wood, a machine that copied a three-dimensional shape automatically. It could turn out a finished stock in a fraction of the time a craftsman needed, and every stock it made was identical to the pattern and to every other stock. The Blanchard lathe was a genuine breakthrough, and its logic reached far beyond gun making. Any irregular shape could now be mass-produced: axe handles, shoe lasts, wheel spokes, tool handles. But it was born here, to solve a government's musket problem, on the government's payroll. Put the pieces together, and the result is something the world had not quite seen before. Standardized parts, checked against gauges, made by specialized machines, assembled into a finished product whose components were interchangeable. By the late 1820s, Springfield could take parts from separate bins and build working muskets without hand-fitting each one. This was the thing that would come to be called the American System of Manufactures, and the name is not an exaggeration. Foreign observers came to look. British delegations, sent to understand how a young country was outproducing older ones, toured the armory and went home describing what they had seen as armory practice, the systematic manufacture of interchangeable parts. It would spread from firearms into sewing machines, into clocks and watches, into bicycles, and eventually into automobiles. The method that let one company make 1 million identical things at a low price per unit was, in large part, worked out inside a federal gun factory in Massachusetts. The path it took into private industry ran, in many cases, straight through the men Springfield had trained. Skilled workers and superintendents who had learned interchangeable manufacture at the armory carried it out into the private economy, hiring on with the companies that would build the American industrial century. Samuel Colt, opening his great private armory at Hartford around 1853, filled it with machine tools by the many hundreds and built repeating pistols on the same interchangeable principles the government arsenals had pioneered. The makers of sewing machines, of clocks, of pocket watches turned out by the millions, of typewriters and bicycles and eventually cars, all drew on the same body of technique. Historians of technology gave the whole approach a name, the American System of Manufactures, and traced its lineage back to the government armories, Springfield foremost among them. Understand what that means as a matter of ownership. The single most valuable industrial idea of the 19th century, the method that would let the United States outproduce the world, was developed at public expense inside a government factory and then absorbed, free of charge, by the private companies that would use it to build private fortunes. The armory could not patent a way of working and charge the nation for it. It simply gave the method away, because it belonged to everyone, because that was the nature of the thing that made it. And here is the quiet irony to hold on to, because it takes more than a century to pay off. The armory's greatest creation was a method that did not need the armory. Interchangeable manufacture was a gift Springfield gave to private industry, and private industry took it, refined it, and scaled it beyond anything a government arsenal would ever match. The armory built the tool that would, in the end, make the argument for its own execution. A day would come when a Secretary of Defense could look at the private factories of America, factories built on Springfield's own method, and ask why the government still needed to make guns at all. That day was 140 years away. Between now and then, the method was about to be tested by the largest and bloodiest manufacturing contract the Armory had ever seen. Chapter 4. The only armory left. For most of its early life, Springfield had a twin. When Washington established the National Armory System in 1794, he authorized 2 federal armories, not one. The second stood at Harper's Ferry, in what is now West Virginia, where the Shenandoah met the Potomac. For 60 years, the 2 arsenals shared the work of arming the nation, developed patterns together, and stood as the twin pillars of federal weapons manufacture. Then came April of 1861, and the twin fell. When Virginia moved toward secession at the outbreak of the Civil War, the federal garrison at Harper's Ferry, unable to hold the exposed river town, set fire to the armory buildings to keep the machinery out of Confederate hands. The Confederates seized what survived, dismantled it, and carried the gun-making machinery south to build their own arsenals. Harper's Ferry, the sister armory, was effectively destroyed as a manufacturer and never rebuilt in that role. Harper's Ferry had been the troubled twin from the start. It sat in a border region, exposed, and it had already been the stage for one of the sparks of the war itself, when the abolitionist John Brown seized its arsenal in 1859 in a doomed attempt to launch a slave uprising, precisely because everyone understood that a national armory was a place where power was stored in physical form. A building full of guns is a strategic object, whether the guns are finished or not. When war came in earnest 2 years later, that exposure proved fatal to Harper's Ferry as a manufacturer. Springfield's founders had chosen its site, decades before, for exactly the safety that Harper's Ferry lacked. In 1861, that old decision, made for reasons of coastal defense in an age of sailing warships, cashed out in a way no one had planned. The safe armory survived, and the exposed one burned. Geography chosen in 1794 decided which arsenal would arm the Union in 1861. That fire changed everything for Springfield. Overnight, the United States government had exactly 1 national armory left, and it sat safely in Massachusetts, hundreds of miles from any Confederate advance, on its defensible hill above the river. The geography Washington had chosen in 1794 for reasons of coastal defense now paid off in a war no one in 1794 had imagined. Springfield was not merely a national armory anymore. It was the national armory, the sole federal source of the standard infantry weapon at the exact moment the country needed more infantry weapons than it had ever needed in its history. A monopoly that had been shared was now held alone, and it was held by the one arsenal the enemy could not reach. It is worth naming what kind of power this was, because it was not the power of a business. A private monopolist holds its position by keeping competitors out of a market, and it can be broken by a rival, a new technology, or a regulator. Springfield's monopoly was of a different and stranger kind. It did not compete for the government's business, because it was the government's business. It could not be undersold, because it did not sell. It could not lose its customer to a rival, because its customer owned it. In 1861, with Harper's Ferry in ashes, this made Springfield something close to unassailable, the single indispensable source of the Union's standard rifle, protected not by market dominance, but by the simple fact of being federal property in a safe location. That is the strongest competitive position a manufacturer can occupy, and it is available to almost no one, because it requires being owned by its only customer. It would take 100 years, and a change in the customer's own thinking, to turn that unassailable position into a fatal one. For now, it simply meant the Union's rifles would come from one place, and that place would decide the pattern. The weapon at the center of it was the Springfield, Model 1861, and it represented a second decision worth naming: standardize the entire Army on one arm and one cartridge. The Model 1861 was a .58 caliber rifle musket, a single-shot muzzleloader, but rifled rather than smoothbore, which gave it range and accuracy the old muskets never had. More important than any single feature was the fact that it was the standard. One pattern, one caliber, one manual of arms, one supply chain of parts and ammunition running to every Union regiment that carried it. This is the Arsenal Systems version of lock-in. A private company locks customers in with a proprietary cartridge that fits only its guns. The government locked in its own army by choosing a single national pattern and committing the entire force to it, so that every rifle, every spare part, and every paper cartridge in the supply train spoke the same language. Standardization is a form of control. The Union had chosen its standard, and the standard was made in Springfield. There is a technical detail underneath the standardization that made it lethal, and it is worth naming because it explains why one pattern mattered so much. The Model 1861 was rifled, its barrel cut with spiral grooves that spun the projectile and gave it range and accuracy no smoothbore musket had ever had, and it fired a conical lead bullet, the type known as the mini-ball, that could be loaded quickly and yet gripped the rifling on firing. This combination turned the ordinary infantryman into a threat at ranges that older tactics never anticipated, and it is part of why the Civil War was so appallingly bloody. But the killing power only became an army-wide fact because the weapon was standardized. One rifling, one caliber, one bullet, one cartridge, made in the millions to a single specification so that every regiment fought with the same reach and drew from the same ammunition supply. A superior weapon issued in 5 different incompatible versions is a quartermaster's nightmare. A superior weapon issued as one national standard is a strategic weapon. The Armory did not just make a better rifle. It made the same better rifle, hundreds of thousands of times, and that sameness was the true product. Now the only question was volume. A country that had been making a few thousand rifles a year suddenly needed to arm hundreds of thousands of men, and then hundreds of thousands more as the war ground on and the casualties mounted. The single surviving Armory would have to do in months what it had once done in decades. The method Roswell, Lee, and Thomas Blanchard had built, the gauges and the machines and the interchangeable parts, was about to face the only test that ever truly matters for a manufacturing system. Not whether it could make a good rifle, whether it could make an ocean of them, fast, without falling apart. Demand was about to go from thousands to 1 million. Chapter 5. 793,000. Between 1861 and 1865, Springfield Armory built 793,434 rifles. The precision of that number is the point. This was not a workshop counting in the hundreds anymore. This was industrial war, measured to the individual weapon. And the arsenal that had made 245 muskets in its first year was now making that many in a matter of days. At the start of the war, monthly output ran around 800 rifles. Within a year, the Armory was pushing past 3,500 a month, and it kept climbing. To get there, Springfield did what a factory under wartime demand does. It ran longer. It ran a 2-shift system, with workdays stretching to 10.5 hours, and it packed the buildings on the hill with the largest workforce they had ever held. Contemporary accounts put the productivity increase across the war years at well over 200%. A larger steam engine was installed in 1862 to drive the milling and rifling machinery harder. The place did not sleep. And Springfield alone was not enough. Even the sole National Armory, running flat out, could not fill the Union's appetite by itself, so the government did the thing the arsenal system existed to avoid, and did it out of necessity. It contracted. It licensed the Springfield pattern to private firms across the North, which turned out something like 1 million more rifle muskets to the government's specification. This is worth sitting with, because it complicates the tidy story of a self-sufficient government arsenal. When the demand was truly extreme, even the Armory leaned on private industry. But note the shape of the arrangement. The private contractors did not design the rifle. They built the government's rifle, to the government's gauges, under the government's control. The design, the standard, and the authority stayed federal. Springfield was still the source of truth. The contractors were just extra hands. The financing underneath the boom deserves a plain word, because it is a character in every industrial expansion, and it is easy to forget when the numbers are patriotic. A factory that multiplies its output does not do so for free. It hires, and a wartime payroll is an obligation. It builds and retools, and new machinery is capital spent. It stockpiles raw material, iron and walnut, and the components of a cartridge, and that inventory is money sitting on a floor. For the Armory, the ultimate backer was the United States Treasury, funding the war on borrowed money as governments at war always do, so the debt did not sit on the Armory's own books the way it would sit on a private firm's. But the shape of the risk was identical. Enormous fixed costs and a swollen workforce. All of it justified by a single source of demand, the war, and all of it exposed the instant that demand disappeared. A business that scales up for one customer is only as stable as that customer's need. The Armory's one customer was the war itself, and wars, unlike companies, are designed to end. There is a scene in this that captures what the Armory had become. Picture the hill above the Connecticut River at the height of the war. The buildings lit and working through the evening shift. The machines that Roswell Lee's system had standardized now running in a way their designers had never had to imagine, spitting out interchangeable barrels and locks and stocks by the tens of thousands, each one identical to the last, each one destined for a soldier in blue. The method, built in peacetime, to solve the problem of a musket whose parts would not fit, had become the thing that let a single factory arm a continent's worth of men. The Model 1861 was not a sophisticated weapon. It was a muzzle loader, a technology as old as the century. But it was made with a sophistication of process that no army had ever brought to bear, and that process was the real weapon. Then the war ended, and the lesson of every boom arrived on schedule. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April of 1865, the demand that had built the 2-shift Armory evaporated almost overnight. Production, which had been running at industrial flood, fell to a few hundred rifles a day, and then the orders simply stopped coming. An army that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands demobilized to a fraction of its wartime size. And a peacetime army does not need 700,000 new rifles. It barely needs any. The armory that had been the most important factory in the Union found itself with warehouses full of weapons, machinery built for a war that was over, and a workforce it could no longer justify. The mechanics of the collapse are worth watching, because they are the mechanics of every bust the armory would ever suffer. The two shifts became one. The one shift shrank. The workers hired to feed the war were let go, back into a northern economy absorbing hundreds of thousands of demobilized soldiers at the same moment. The machinery that had been run past its limits fell silent, still standing, still owned, still costing money to house and maintain, but idle, because there was nothing left to make. An idle factory is not a neutral thing. It is a liability that used to be an asset, the same buildings and engines and tools, now producing nothing while still demanding to be kept. Springfield had learned in the space of a few months the lesson that a boom conceals and a bust reveals. Capacity built for a peak is a burden in a valley. Demand built on a single war disappears when the war does. Springfield had reached a peak it would not touch again for 50 years, and now it had to survive the peace. The next rifle it built would be shaped not by victory, but by thrift. Chapter 6. The Trapdoor Bargain. After the Civil War, the United States had a strange problem. It had won, it had a proven single-shot rifle, and it had hundreds of thousands of them stacked in government warehouses, and yet the world had already moved past them. The muzzleloader was obsolete. Armies were converting to breech loaders, weapons loaded from the rear that a soldier could reload lying down, far faster than any muzzleloader allowed. Springfield needed to modernize. But the Treasury had no appetite, in the lean years after an enormously expensive war, for scrapping a mountain of serviceable rifles and starting over. So the Armory found a bargain, and the bargain was the whole point. The solution came from inside the building, from a master armorer named Erskine Allen. Allen devised a way to convert an existing muzzle-loading rifle musket into a breech loader by cutting into the top of the barrel and fitting a hinged breech block that flipped up and forward to accept a metallic cartridge. It looked a little like a small trapdoor, and the name stuck. The Trapdoor Springfield let the government take rifles it already owned and upgrade them into modern breech loaders at a fraction of the cost of building new ones. The earliest conversions, in the years just after the war, transformed thousands of existing weapons this way. The design matured into the model 1873, chambered for the 45-70 government cartridge, and it became the standard American service rifle for the next 2 decades. By the early 1890s, Springfield had produced well over 500,000 trapdoor rifles and carbines, and the 45-70 became one of the most enduring cartridges the country ever adopted. The economics of the conversion are the reason to admire the decision, coldly, as a matter of stewardship. A nation exhausted by war and wary of spending had an enormous sunk asset, hundreds of thousands of rifle muskets already paid for, already in inventory, and suddenly obsolete. The expensive path was to write them all off and manufacture a new breech loader from scratch. The cheap path, the Allen path, was to treat the existing rifles as raw material and upgrade them, salvaging the barrels and stocks and much of the lockwork and adding only the new breech mechanism. It let the government modernize its infantry at a fraction of the cost of starting over, and it kept the armory working through the lean years when a new build program might never have been funded at all. The trapdoor was not the best rifle in the world when it appeared, and it grew less so every year the world moved toward repeaters. But it was a shrewd use of what the government already owned, and shrewd use of a sunk asset is a business skill, not a military one. The armory had learned to be thrifty, and thrift kept it alive. Now look at who profited, because this is the arsenal system's defining feature, and it is easy to miss. Erskine Allen designed the mechanism that armed the American soldier through the entire era of the Indian Wars. He did it as an employee of the United States government, on a government salary. The design belonged to the government. Allen did not own a patent he could license to the Army for a royalty on every rifle. He could not, because he had developed it as part of his federal job, and the fruit of that job belonged to his employer. 500,000 rifles carried his breech design, and Allen drew a paycheck. This was not an accident or an injustice in the eyes of the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. The whole reason a government owns an arsenal, rather than buying from private inventors, is so that it captures the value of what its people create instead of paying a premium to an outside patent holder. The arsenal kept the value. The man kept his wage. Remember that arrangement, because in 50 years it will produce the most famous rifle designer in American history and pay him almost nothing. And it armed a genuinely long chapter of American history. The trapdoor, in its various forms, was the standard United States service rifle for roughly 2 decades, carrying the small frontier army through the Indian Wars across the West, chambered in a cartridge, the 45-70, that threw a heavy lead bullet with authority out past several hundred yards, and that remains in use by hunters and shooters to this day, a century and a half later. That endurance is its own quiet verdict. The 45-70 outlived the rifle it was designed for, outlived the wars it was issued for, and outlived the Armory itself. A cartridge adopted in 1873 by a treasury pinching pennies became one of the most enduring rounds the country ever standardized. The bargain rifle turned out to have a very long life, even if the institution that built it did not. The trapdoor also carried the Armory into its most mythologized moment, and it is a moment that has to be handled carefully. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where Custer's command was destroyed, some accounts hold that the trapdoor carbines carried by the cavalry suffered extraction failures, the spent cartridge case jamming in the breech and putting the weapon out of action at the worst possible time. Whether that failure was widespread enough to have mattered to the outcome is contested, and careful historians caution against leaning on it too hard. What is not contested is the larger truth the battle pointed at. The single-shot trapdoor, however economical, was a weapon of the past in a world moving towards smokeless powder and repeating rifles that could fire many rounds without reloading. The bargain had armed a generation cheaply. It had also left the United States a step behind, and catching up would mean going somewhere the Armory had spent a century trying to avoid. It would mean renting a foreigner's design. Chapter 7. The gun America had to rent. The arsenal that existed to keep America independent of foreign gunmakers spent the turn of the century adopting foreign designs and paying foreign companies for the privilege. That sentence is the whole chapter, and it is one of the sharpest ironies in the Armory's history. The trouble began with the search for a repeater. By the early 1890s, the single-shot trapdoor was indefensible. Every serious army was moving to bolt-action rifles that fed from a magazine and fired smokeless powder, which produced far less smoke, fouling, and muzzle flash than the old black powder. Springfield did not have such a rifle, and it did not have a smokeless design of its own ready to go. So in 1892, after a series of trials, the United States adopted a rifle designed not in Massachusetts, but in Norway, the Krag-Jorgensen. It was a Scandinavian design, licensed and then manufactured at Springfield, and it was chambered for the new .30-40 cartridge, the first smokeless round the United States military ever issued. The Armory tooled up and began building Krags in the mid-1890s. Across its several models, produced from 1894 into the early 1900s, Springfield turned out something on the order of 340,000 of them. The National Armory was now, for the first time, mass-producing a rifle whose fundamental design had come from abroad. The Krag's weaknesses were exposed almost immediately, and they were exposed in combat. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, American soldiers carrying Krags met Spanish troops carrying Mausers, the German-designed bolt action that loaded its magazine in one motion from a stripper clip. The Krag loaded one round at a time through a side gate. In a firefight, the difference was stark. The Mauser could be topped up in a single fast movement. The Krag had to be fed cartridge by cartridge. American officers came home from Cuba deeply impressed by the enemy's rifle and dissatisfied with their own. The verdict was not subtle. The Mauser was the better system, and everyone who had faced one knew it. So Springfield did what the moment demanded and what its whole reason for being seemed to forbid. It copied the Mauser. The rifle that resulted, adopted on the 19th of June, 1903, was the Springfield Model 1903, and it borrowed so heavily from the German design that it was, in the features that mattered, a Mauser in American dress. The bolt, the locking system, the stripper clip loading, the two-piece firing mechanism, all of it drew directly on Mauser patents, and the German firm noticed. Mauser pursued the United States government for patent infringement, and the United States government, the sovereign owner of the national arsenal, the institution founded specifically so America would never depend on foreign arms makers, settled. It agreed to pay Mauser a royalty of 75 cents per rifle, plus 50 cents per 1,000 stripper clips, up to a cap of $200,000. The payments ran until the cap was reached, with the final installment made in July of 1909. Read that arrangement as a businessman would. The government that owned everything, that captured the value of its own inventor's work precisely so it would never pay an outside patent holder, was now cutting royalty checks to a German company for the design of its own flagship service rifle. Even a monopoly does not own the ideas it copies. There is a temptation to read the royalty as a humiliation, and it is worth resisting, because the deeper point is about how ideas actually move. No arsenal, however grand, invents in a vacuum. The best rifle mechanism in the world in 1900 was Mauser's, and the sensible thing for any army was to adopt what worked, foreign or not, and the honest thing was to pay for it. What is striking is not that Springfield borrowed, but the contrast between the Armory's founding myth and its actual practice. The institution existed to make America independent of foreign gunmakers, and here it was, at the dawn of the 20th century, building a Norwegian repeater, then replacing it with a German-patterned bolt action, then cutting checks to a German firm for the privilege. Self-sufficiency, it turned out, was never total. The arsenal made the guns. It did not always own the ideas inside them, and a monopoly on manufacturing is not a monopoly on invention. Those are different things, and the difference would matter enormously 60 years later when the best idea for the next American rifle again came from outside the arsenal walls, and the government again faced the question of whether to make or to buy. The 1903 had one more embarrassment to get through before it became great. The original version carried a rod bayonet, a thin spike that stored inside the stock and slid out the front. President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who had led a cavalry charge with his own rifle in hand and had opinions about weapons, was appalled by it. In a letter to the Secretary of War dated the 4th of January, 1905, he wrote that the rod bayonet was about as poor an invention as he had ever seen, so worthless that it would bend on contact. Production was halted in 1905 so the design could be fixed, and when it resumed later that year, the rod bayonet was gone, replaced by a proper knife bayonet. The president had personally overruled the Armory's engineering. It was a reminder of who actually owned this company. The customer was the government, and the government could be a single, strong-willed man with a pen. But once corrected, the model 1903 became something the Krag and the Trapdoor never were. It was superb. Accurate, strong, reliable, it would serve as the standard American rifle through the First World War and remain in service, in various roles, for decades after, prized by marksmen and snipers well into the Second World War. The rifle America had to rent, patched together from a Norwegian repeater and a German bolt system and a presidential correction, turned into one of the finest bolt-action service rifles ever fielded. And it would arm the country through the largest war the world had yet seen, which meant the Armory was about to boom again, and to pay, again, the hidden price that every boom at Springfield seemed to carry. Chapter 8. 5,000 Hands. When the United States entered the First World War in April of 1917, Springfield had to do what it had done in 1861, only faster and against a modern industrial enemy. In the years before the war, the Model 1903 had been produced at a steady peacetime trickle. Serial numbers tell the story of the ramp. The first 16,000 rifles came off the line in 1903 itself. By the middle of 1916, cumulative production had passed 630,000. Then the war turned the trickle into a flood. In 1917, Springfield produced nearly 129,000 rifles. In 1918, it produced more than 243,000. The workforce on the Hill swelled past 5,000 people. The productivity gains reported across the war years again ran well over 200%, the same brutal arithmetic of a factory asked to multiply itself in months. Springfield could not meet the entire demand alone, any more than it had in the Civil War, and so the famous story of American rifle production in the First World War is partly a story of a different rifle built by private industry to fill the gap. But the Armory itself ran at a pace it had not seen since the 1860s. The story of the rifle that filled the gap is the sharpest business lesson of the war, and it points straight at the arsenal's future. When the United States entered the conflict in 1917, it did not have enough Model 1903 rifles, and it could not build them fast enough, because Springfield and the government's Rock Island arsenal were only 2 factories. So the Army turned to private industry, which happened to be tooled up to build a British rifle, the pattern that became the American Model 1917 Enfield, in large commercial plants. Those private factories, running the interchangeable methods the arsenals had taught the country a century before, outproduced the government's own rifle by a wide margin. Across the war, the private-built Model 1917 was made in far greater numbers than the arsenal-built Model 1903, and it ended up in the hands of more American soldiers in France than the official standard rifle did. Sit with that inversion. In the country's largest war to date, the government arsenal was not the main source of rifles. Private industry was. The Armory was still the keeper of the standard, still the design authority, still the institution. But on sheer volume, when the demand was greatest, the private sector had already surpassed it. The argument McNamara would make in the 1960s, that private industry could arm the nation without a government factory, had a first draft written in 1918, and almost no one noticed. It was not only rifles. During these years, Springfield also took on the manufacture of the Meter's 1911 pistol, the .45 automatic designed by John Browning and adopted by the Army in 1911. The Armory built something like 25,000 of them between 1914 and 1918, producing another maker's design under the government's roof because the government needed the volume. The National Arsenal had become a general-purpose war factory, turning out whatever the front demanded, drawing on whatever design worked, its own or another's. And then came the hidden bill, the one that speed always seems to leave at Springfield. In the rush of wartime production, the Armory's heat treating of the rifle receivers, the critical steel component that contains the pressure of firing, was not always properly controlled. Receivers made below a certain point in the serial number range were, in some cases, heat treated by eye and by guesswork rather than by instrument, and some of them came out brittle. A brittle receiver can shatter when a cartridge fires, sending fragments of steel back toward the shooter's face. The problem was serious enough that, years later, rifles below roughly the 800,000 serial mark came to be regarded with caution, and the low-numbered receivers became a known hazard among those who understood them. This was not sabotage, and it was not incompetence in the ordinary sense. It was the predictable cost of demanding maximum output at maximum speed, the corner that gets cut when a factory is asked to do the impossible on a deadline. The boom's real price is rarely on the invoice. It shows up later, in quality, in the parts that were made too fast to be made right. None of this diminished what the Model 1903 became, and the contradiction is characteristic of the Armory. The same rifle whose wartime receivers had to be watched for brittleness was, in its properly made form, one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever issued. So accurate and so durable that it soldiered on for decades, serving as a sniper's rifle deep into the Second World War, long after it had been replaced as the standard infantry arm by Garand's self-loader. A weapon can carry both truths at once: an excellent design and a production history stained by the compromises of a rush. That is the honest shape of manufacturing at scale under a deadline. The design is one thing, born in the calm of the drawing board and the test range. The production is another, born in the heat of a war that demands more than any factory can safely give, and the gap between them is where the hidden costs live. Springfield's engineers had drawn a superb rifle. Springfield's wartime floor, ordered to make it faster than it could be made well, had left a flaw in some fraction of them that would outlive the war by generations. The armistice came on the 11th of November, 1918, and with it came the pattern the Armory knew too well. The contracts stopped. The enormous wartime demand vanished. The workforce that had grown past 5,000 was no longer needed, and Springfield contracted back down into another long peace. Twice now, the Armory had been called to industrial flood, and twice the flood had receded, leaving behind machinery built for a war that was over and a payroll the peacetime army could not justify. But something was happening in those quiet years between the wars that would matter more than any production number. Inside the shrunken Armory, on a modest government salary, a man who had arrived in 1919 was spending more than a decade working on a rifle that did not yet exist. A rifle that would load and fire itself, and it would become the single most produced weapon in the Armory's history. He would never make a dollar from it. Chapter 9. The man who owned nothing, he built. He was not born American, and he was not trained as an engineer. John Cantius Garand was born in Quebec, in Canada, in 1888, one of a large family, and he grew up around textile mills and machine shops rather than universities. He was a toolmaker, a man who understood machines with his hands before he understood them on paper, and he came to Springfield Armory on the 4th of November, 1919, hired as a skilled laborer at a salary of about $300 a month. He would stay for the rest of his working life, until he retired in 1953, and in those decades he would design the rifle that carried his name into the memory of a nation. He would also demonstrate, more completely than anyone before him, exactly how the arsenal system treated the people who made it great. The problem Garand set himself was the one every army in the world wanted solved and none had solved for general issue: a self-loading rifle. A weapon that used the energy of each shot to eject the spent case, chamber a fresh cartridge, and cock itself, so the soldier could fire again simply by pulling the trigger, without working a bolt by hand. A semi-automatic service rifle would give an individual infantryman a rate of fire that a bolt action could not touch. The difficulty was making such a mechanism reliable enough, and cheap enough, to hand to millions of ordinary soldiers in the mud and dust of a real war. Garand worked at it for more than 15 years. He tried different operating systems, different cartridges, different mechanisms, filing and testing and refiling year after year inside the Armory's shops. It was slow, patient, unglamorous work, the opposite of a sudden invention. And it produced, at last, a rifle that worked. The path to that working rifle ran through a fight over a cartridge, and the fight shows again who really owned the decisions. Garand had at one point developed his rifle around a smaller, lighter round, a .276 caliber cartridge, and by many technical measures it was the better choice for a self-loading rifle, easier on the mechanism, lighter to carry in quantity. The Army's ordnance experts favored it. But the country sat in the depths of the Great Depression, with warehouses full of the existing .30-06 cartridge left over from the last war and the machinery to make more of it already paid for. General Douglas MacArthur, then the Army Chief of Staff, intervened and insisted the new rifle be built around the existing .30-06, precisely so the nation would not have to scrap its enormous stockpile and retool its ammunition plants in a time of no money. It was a thrift decision, the same instinct that had produced the trapdoor 60 years earlier, imposed from the top over the technical preference of the designers. Garand redesigned the rifle around the larger cartridge. The point is not whether MacArthur was right. The point is that the man at the bench did not decide. The owner decided, as the owner always had, and the designer built what the owner chose. On the 9th of January, 1936, the United States adopted it as the Meters-1 rifle, the standard infantry weapon of the Army. It was the first semi-automatic rifle to be adopted as the standard service arm of any major military in the world, and that distinction is not a small one. While the rest of the world's armies would go into the Second World War with bolt-action rifles their grandfathers would have recognized, the American infantryman would carry a rifle that reloaded itself. General George Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. That judgment can be argued, but the advantage it described was real, and it belonged to the United States because one Canadian-born toolmaker had spent 15 years on a government bench solving a problem no one else had solved for mass issue. Now the reckoning. And it is the payoff of a debt this story planted decades earlier. John Garand did not receive a royalty for the Meters-1 rifle, not a cent. He had designed it as an employee of the United States government, and under the arsenal system, the design belonged to his employer, exactly as Erskine Allen's trapdoor breech had belonged to the government 2 generations before. The rifle would eventually be produced in the millions, more than 5 million across all makers before it was done, and the man who designed it drew his federal salary and nothing more. His pay did rise over the years, as a senior government engineer's would. By the war years, his salary had climbed to around $8,000, a comfortable professional income, and it inched a little higher for meritorious service before he retired. But there was no fortune, no percentage, no wealth commensurate with the thing he had made. There was an attempt to fix that. In July of 1941, a congressman from Massachusetts introduced a bill, House Resolution 5276, proposing to pay Garand $100,000 in recognition of his very valuable services in developing the rifle. The bill did not pass. Congress debated whether to reward the man who had armed the American infantry, and decided against it, and Garand went back to his bench. By every account, Garand himself made no great protest about it. He was, by temperament, a workman rather than a promoter, a man more interested in the mechanism than in the money or the fame, and he stayed at his bench at the Armory through the war and beyond, refining the rifle, helping solve its production problems, working on what would come next. He had a government job he valued, a good professional salary, and the respect of the men who understood what he had done. He was not cheated in any narrow legal sense. He had known the terms of federal employment when he took the job, and the design belonged to the government by the plain rules of that employment. But step back from the legalities, and the human arithmetic is stark. The rifle that a nation credited with helping win a world war, the weapon a famous general called the greatest ever devised, made its designer no fortune at all, while the institution that employed him captured everything, and the name it was built under would later make strangers rich. Garand's contentment does not soften the structure. It only shows that the structure did not need the man to be bitter in order to take everything he made. Sit with the arithmetic, because it is the arsenal system reduced to a single human being. 5 million rifles, one designer, $0 in royalties. This is not a scandal in the ordinary sense. It is the deliberate logic of a government that owns its arsenal. The whole reason the United States built and kept Springfield, rather than buying its guns from private inventors, was so that it would capture the full value of what its people created, instead of paying a premium to a patent holder on every unit. For a century and a half, that logic had served the Treasury beautifully. It also meant that the most productive weapons designer in American history worked for wages while the thing he built made the nation, and various private companies, and eventually a brand that stole the Armory's name, a great deal of money. Garand owned nothing he built. That was the point of the whole institution, and the rifle he owned nothing of was about to be manufactured on a scale that would dwarf every boom the Armory had ever known. Chapter 10. 4 million Garands. The Second World War turned Springfield into the largest rifle factory the United States had ever operated, and the numbers climbed like a fever chart. The Meters-1 had been produced slowly through the late 1930s while the design was refined and the tooling matured. By the end of 1939, cumulative production stood at roughly 23,000 rifles, a modest figure. Then the world caught fire, and the Armory was ordered to multiply. By the end of 1941, cumulative Meters-1 production had reached about 430,000. By the end of 1942, it had passed 1,090,000. By the end of 1943, more than 2,300,000. By the end of 1944, more than 3,350,000. By October of 1945, cumulative production stood near 3,900,000 rifles from Springfield alone, with more built under contract by Winchester, pushing the total number of Meters-1 Garands past 5 million before the era was over. The rifle that had taken one man 15 years to design was now coming off the line by the thousand every single day. To do it, the Armory transformed itself in ways that went beyond machinery. The workforce, which had numbered around 1,000 in the lean years, exploded towards 7,500 at the wartime peak. And because the men were being drafted and sent to carry the very rifles being built, a large share of the people building them were women. By many accounts, something close to 43% of the wartime workforce was female. Women running the milling machines and gauging the parts and assembling the rifles that their brothers and husbands would carry into Europe and the Pacific. At its peak, the Armory could turn out around 1,300 meters, one rifles in a single shift. Better than a rifle every 3 minutes. Hour after hour, the American system of interchangeable manufacture running at an intensity its 19th century inventors could not have pictured. Even this, the Armory's supreme achievement, was not achieved by the Armory alone, and the qualification matters for where the story is going. The meters one was so complex to tool for that bringing a second manufacturer online took years, but the government did it, contracting Winchester to build the rifle as well, so that the private company produced a substantial share of the Garands that armed the war. Once again, the pattern held. In the crisis, the arsenal was the heart of production, but not the whole of it, and private industry stood beside it, building the government's design under the government's control. The difference between 1943 and 1963 would not be whether private industry could build military rifles. It plainly could, and had, in 2 world wars. The difference would be whether private industry could design them too, and do it better than the arsenal. Because the day it could, the last unique justification for a government gun factory would be gone. In 1943, that day still seemed unimaginable. The Armory was designing the finest rifle in the world and teaching a private company to build it. The idea that the roles might someday reverse belonged to a future no one on the wartime floor was paid to imagine. There is a scene worth holding here, because it is the high watermark of the entire 174-year story. Stand in the Armory in 1944. The buildings on the hill are running around the clock. Thousands of workers, nearly half of them women, are feeding a process that turns raw steel and walnut into a finished, self-loading rifle every few minutes, each one identical to the last, each one interchangeable with every other, each one bound for a soldier somewhere on a front that spans the globe. This is the government-owned arms company at the absolute summit of its power and its justification. In this moment, the case for the arsenal is unanswerable. No private arrangement could have been trusted to do this, at this scale, on this schedule, for this purpose. The decision made in 1794, to make rather than buy, to own the factory and the method and the men, is vindicated completely, in steel, at a rate of 1,300 rifles a shift. And that is precisely the trap. The peak was the vindication, and the peak was also the beginning of the end, though no one on that factory floor could have known it. Because the same war that proved the Armory indispensable also built up an American private arms industry of enormous capacity. Factories full of the interchangeable parts machinery that Springfield itself had invented, run by companies that had just proven they could produce military weapons by the million. When the war ended and the demand collapsed once more, the Armory would face the familiar peacetime shrinkage, but this time into a world where private industry had matched and in some ways exceeded the government's own manufacturing prowess. The question that had been unthinkable in 1794 and unanswerable in 1944 was becoming askable. If private companies can now do this too, why does the government need its own gun factory at all? At its very zenith, the Armory had never looked more essential. That is exactly when the argument to kill it began to form. Chapter 11. Buy, don't make. The weapon that broke the arsenal was one of its own. After the Second World War and the Korean War, the Army wanted a single rifle to replace the whole tangle of weapons its soldiers carried. The Meters 1 rifle, the carbine, the submachine gun, the automatic rifle, all folded into one. Springfield's answer was the Meters 14, a rifle descended directly from the Garand, chambered for a powerful new .30 caliber cartridge capable of automatic fire. It was adopted in 1957, and Springfield began production in July of 1959. On paper, it was the logical next step, the arsenal doing what it had always done, evolving its own proven design in-house. In practice, it walked the Armory into a trap. The Meters 14 program was slow and troubled from the start. Getting it into mass production took years, and the rifles did not reach the troops in the numbers promised on anything like the schedule promised. By October of 1963, more than 4 years after production began, only about 167,000 Meters 14s had been completed, a fraction of what the Army needed to re-equip its forces. The program had been in development, in one form or another, for the better part of a decade before that. To a new kind of official looking at the numbers, this was not the picture of an indispensable national asset. It was the picture of a slow, expensive supplier that could not deliver. That new kind of official was Robert McNamara. McNamara had come to the Pentagon as Secretary of Defense from the presidency of the Ford Motor Company, and he brought with him a way of thinking that was, at its core, the way of thinking of a modern corporation. He believed in analysis, in numbers, in cost-effectiveness, in comparing options on a spreadsheet and choosing the one that delivered the most capability per dollar. He did not share the century and a half of institutional loyalty that surrounded the arsenal system. To McNamara, Springfield was not a sacred national institution. It was a supplier, and a supplier had to justify itself on cost and performance like any other. And there was now a competing supplier, from the private sector, offering a very different product. That product was the AR-15, the lightweight rifle designed by Eugene Stoner at Armory and manufactured by Colt, chambered for a small, fast .223 cartridge. It would enter service as the Meters 16. Where the Meters 14 was heavy and fired a big cartridge, the AR-15 was light and fired a small one, which meant a soldier could carry far more ammunition for the same weight. In January of 1963, after evaluations that showed each rifle had strengths, McNamara concluded that the private sector AR-15 was the superior weapon system and moved to halt Meters 14 production. The Armory's own rifle, its evolution of the beloved Garand, was being set aside in favor of a gun designed and built entirely by private industry. To understand why this decision fell the way it did means understanding the man's whole project, because the Meters 14 was only one piece of it. McNamara had arrived at the Pentagon determined to impose on the sprawling, tradition-bound military the disciplines of modern corporate management. He had brought analysts with him, young men fluent in statistics and systems analysis, and he had set them to work measuring everything the Defense Department did against the yardstick of cost-effectiveness. Programs that could not justify themselves in that language were candidates for the axe, regardless of how venerable they were. In that framework, a government-owned factory was not an institution to be revered. It was an in-house supplier to be compared, on price and performance, against the alternative of buying from the private market. Every large corporation that McNamara had known faced the same question about its own divisions, the classic make-or-buy decision. And the answer was always the same. Keep making a thing in-house only where the organization does it better or cheaper than an outside vendor could. Springfield, running an expensive plant to build a troubled rifle that private industry could apparently supply more cheaply, was failing that test on its face. The arsenal was about to be judged not as a piece of American heritage, but as a business unit, and business units that fail the make-or-buy test get closed. Read the decision as the make versus buy choice it truly was, because that is the level on which it actually turned. For 170 years, the United States had chosen to make its own rifles, to own the design and the factory and the workforce. McNamara was choosing, for the future standard rifle, to buy, to let a private company do the designing and the building and simply purchase the result. And embedded in that choice was an accusation that had long been whispered about the arsenal system and now had a powerful believer. The accusation was that a government arsenal, asked to evaluate rifles, would always be biased toward its own designs, that it could not be a neutral judge of a competitor's weapon because it was also a competing manufacturer. A private supplier had no such conflict. Whether or not that critique was fair to the men at Springfield, it was fatal, because it turned the arsenal's greatest asset, its in-house design capability, into a liability. The thing that had justified the Armory for a century, that it designed as well as built, was now the very thing held against it. The bias accusation deserves a closer look, because it is the hinge on which the arsenal's fate turned, and because it was, in a narrow sense, unanswerable. A government arsenal that both designs rifles and advises the Army on which rifle to adopt is, structurally, judging a contest in which it is also a contestant. When Springfield's engineers evaluated an outside design, like the AR-15, against their own Meters 14, there was no way to prove their judgment was untainted, because the institution had an interest in the outcome. This did not require anyone at the Armory to be dishonest. The conflict was built into the arrangement itself. A private supplier evaluating its own product against a rival's would face the identical suspicion, which is exactly why armies try not to let suppliers grade their own homework. For a century and a half, the fact that Springfield, designed as well as built, had been its crown, the thing that justified keeping the whole institution rather than simply buying finished guns. Now that same fact was recast as a disqualifying conflict of interest. The crown had become the noose. The Armory's design capability, its deepest asset, was the very thing that made it impossible to trust as a neutral judge, and impossible to keep once a cheaper, cleaner alternative existed. There is one more contrast that captures the whole shift. The Meters 14 had taken something like a decade to develop and field. McNamara's decision to set it aside for the AR-15 took roughly 4 months. A decade of institutional process, overturned in a season by an executive with a comparative analysis. That was the new world. And once the decision to buy rather than make had been taken for the standard rifle, the arsenal that existed to make it had lost its reason to exist. It was no longer the heart of American arms. It was a line item, and line items can be cut. Chapter 12. the 174-year line item. The end, when it came, arrived with the calm vocabulary of management. There was no battle, no scandal, no dramatic failure. There was a study. In November of 1964, the Department of Defense announced that Springfield Armory would be closed. To support and justify the decision, the government turned to the tools of corporate analysis, commissioning outside review of whether the armory was still needed. A report by the management consulting firm Booz Allen Hamilton, delivered around October of 1965, concluded that it was not. The nation's arms needs, the analysis held, could be met by private industry and other facilities. The armory was found to be running at only a fraction of its capacity, by some measures around 37%, an expensive plant sitting half idle. In the language of the spreadsheet, the case was closed. A supplier operating at 37% of capacity, whose function could be bought elsewhere, does not survive a cost review. The announcement did not go unopposed, and the shape of the opposition is telling. The armory was the economic heart of a city, the employer of thousands, a source of civic identity that reached back to before the Republic had a constitution. And its closing was fought by the people it would harm, by local officials and members of Congress from Massachusetts who understood exactly what the loss would mean to Springfield, the city. But this was the weakness of being a government institution rather than a business. The armory had no market it could turn to, no new customers it could win, no product it could pivot to selling. Its only customer was the government, and the government had decided it was no longer needed. A private company that loses one customer can look for another. A government arsenal whose owner no longer wants it has nowhere to go. The very thing that had made it powerful, that it served the state and only the state, left it utterly defenseless the moment the state changed its mind. The decision was made in the language of cost-effectiveness, and against that language the arguments of a city and its congressmen had no standing. And so, on the 20th of April, 1968, after 174 years, Springfield Armory ceased operations, with the formal closure recorded at the end of that month. The oldest continuously operating arms factory in the country, the institution George Washington had authorized, the place Daniel Shays had marched on, the factory that built the Model 1795 and the Model 1861 and the trapdoor and the 1903 and the Garand and the Meters 14, simply stopped. The human cost was counted the way such costs are counted. About 2,275 jobs were lost. An annual payroll of roughly $19.5 million vanished from the economy of a Massachusetts city that had grown up around the armory for the better part of 2 centuries. The town that had been synonymous with the making of American arms was, overnight, a town whose great factory was closed. Now, the irony that was planted 140 years earlier comes due, and it deserves to be named exactly. Look back to Chapter 3, to Roswell Lee and Thomas Blanchard and the invention of interchangeable manufacture inside these walls in the 1820s. That method, the American system, was the armory's gift to the world, and the world had taken it. Over the following century, private American industry had absorbed interchangeable parts manufacturing so completely that it built cars and appliances and, when needed, weapons by the million. By 1968, the private arms industry that could make Springfield redundant existed only because Springfield had taught the country how to manufacture in the first place. The armory had perfected the method that made its own factory unnecessary. It had, across 140 years, built the tool of its own obsolescence, handed it to private industry, and then been closed on the grounds that private industry could now do the job. The arsenal did not die of failure. It died of the success of the very idea it had invented. The functions did not vanish so much as disperse. The government did not exit the business of designing and testing weapons entirely. That work moved elsewhere, into other facilities and other arsenals that survived the same era, and into an ever-closer partnership with the private companies that would now do most of the actual manufacturing. Rifle production for the United States became, permanently, a private sector affair, the government buying from Colt and its successors rather than building in its own shops. What ended in 1968 was not American weapons development. What ended was the specific 200-year-old model of a great government factory that designed and built the nation's standard arms under one roof, employing its own workforce, owning its own machines, capturing the value of its own inventions. That model, born in 1794 out of necessity because no American industry existed to buy from, died in 1968 because a mighty American industry now did. The arsenal system had, in a sense, worked itself out of a job by helping to create the very private industry that replaced it. There is a way of seeing McNamara's decision as simply correct, and honesty requires acknowledging it. The AR-15 lineage did become the American standard and remains so, in evolved form, generations later. Private industry did prove capable of designing and building the country's rifles. A government running a half-idle factory to do work the market could do more cheaply was, by the cold logic of cost-effectiveness, hard to defend. The make versus buy calculation that had come out one way in 1794, when there was no American industry to buy from, simply came out the other way in 1968, when there was. That is not villainy. It is arithmetic. The same arithmetic the Armory had always lived by, finally turned against it. But arithmetic does not soften the ending. An institution that had outlasted every war the Republic had ever fought was closed by a consultant's report and a comparison of unit costs. The factory was dead. And yet the most valuable thing it had ever produced was not any rifle, and it was not the factory. It was the name. And the name was still lying there, unclaimed, worth more than anyone at the Pentagon had thought to notice. Chapter 13. The name someone else rescued. When the government closed the Armory, it kept the buildings and let go of the name, and that turned out to be exactly backwards. The physical site was preserved as history. In October of 1974, Congress passed Public Law 93-486, establishing the Springfield Armory National Historic Site, and the National Park Service took over management of the grounds later in the decade. The old Armory became a museum, some 55 acres of National Historic Site holding one of the great firearms collections in the world, thousands of weapons documenting the story this script has told. The government had turned its dead arms company into a monument to itself. It was a fitting and honorable end for the buildings. It did nothing at all to protect the name. Because in that very same year, 1974, a private family did what the government had not thought to do. They took the name. The Reese family acquired the rights to the Springfield Armory name and built a private firearms company around it, based not in Massachusetts, but in Geneseo, Illinois. The company had no corporate connection whatsoever to the original government arsenal. It had not descended from it, not bought its assets, not inherited its workforce or its factory. It had simply acquired the use of a famous name that the government had allowed to lapse into availability, and it wore that name openly, adopting over time the motto that it was the first name in American firearms, a phrase whose authority rested entirely on a history the company had played no part in making. The institution that had earned the name over 174 years was a museum. The name itself was now a brand on a new company's rifles and pistols. The asymmetry in what the government chose to keep is the whole lesson in miniature. When the Armory closed, the government looked at its assets the way an accountant looks at a balance sheet, and it saw land, buildings, machinery, and a collection of historic firearms, tangible things with a value that could be listed. It preserved those. What it did not see, because it does not appear on any balance sheet, was the intangible asset that was worth more than all the buildings combined. The name. The reputation. The century and a half of accumulated meaning that made the words Springfield Armory instantly credible to anyone who bought a gun. That asset was invisible to the government precisely because the government had never had to think about it, never had to market itself, never had to compete for a customer's trust, because its customer was captive and its authority was simply assumed. So it kept the walls and let the reputation walk out the door. A private company would have understood immediately that the brand was the crown jewel. The government understood only that the buildings were historic, and the brand thrived. The modern Springfield Armory, Incorporated, built a substantial business on that borrowed authority. It produced civilian versions of the Meters 14 pattern, called the Meters 1A, and later its own lines of rifles and imported handguns, and it grew into a major American firearms company. By around 2021, it was producing on the order of 590,000 firearms in a single year. By 2022, its revenue was reported at more than $220 million. Set those figures against the story of the arsenal. The government's Armory had, in many of its years, produced far fewer guns than that. Only in its greatest wartime booms had it exceeded such numbers. A private company wearing the dead institution's name was now, in an ordinary peacetime year, outproducing what the original had managed across most of its history, and earning a fortune the government arsenal, forbidden by its very nature from turning a profit, was never permitted to make. The motto is the part that lands hardest, because of what it claims and who is claiming it. The first name in American firearms. As a statement about the original Springfield Armory, it is almost literally true. The government arsenal genuinely was, in the order of history, close to the first name in American firearms, the founding institution of the nation's arms-making. As a statement made by a private company founded in 1974 in Illinois, it is a claim to inherit a history the company did not live, an authority it did not build, a primacy it acquired by registration rather than by earning. And it works. It works because the meaning attached to the words is real, paid for over 174 years by someone else, and a customer reading it on a rifle feels the weight of that history without needing to know that the company invoking it is 6 decades old and unconnected to any of it. This is what a brand is, in the end. It is stored meaning, and stored meaning can be transferred to a new owner who did nothing to create it. The government created the meaning and stored it in the name. A private family took delivery of the storehouse. This is the payoff of the promise this story opened with, and it is the whole thesis in a single image. The United States government spent 174 years and an incalculable sum making the words Springfield Armory mean something, making them a byword for American arms, paying for that meaning in appropriations and wars and the uncompensated genius of men like Erskine Allen and John Garand. Then it closed the factory and let the name go. And a family with no connection to any of it picked the name up, essentially for the cost of claiming it, and turned that century and a half of accumulated meaning into a private fortune. The government built the brand. Someone else banked it. The old money families and famous companies of American manufacturing had never had to touch Springfield, because Springfield had never been for sale in the ordinary sense. It was the government's. And when the government was done with it, the most valuable asset it had ever created, the name, went to whoever reached for it first. Here is the whole account, laid out cold. One arsenal, established in 1794, closed in 1968, 174 years. A single-shot flintlock musket copied from the French. A rifled musket that armed a civil war. A cheap breech-loading conversion that armed the frontier. A bolt-action rented from a German patent. The first self-loading service rifle in the world. And a final battle rifle that could not be built fast enough to survive its own procurement. 4 great booms in the War of 1812, the Civil War, the First World War, and the Second, each followed by a collapse into peace. A method of manufacture invented along the way that remade the entire American economy. A closure carried out not by an enemy but by an accountant's report. And a name that outlived all of it and now belongs to strangers. The lesson sits in the gap between the institution and the name. And that gap is where the real business story has always lived. Springfield Armory, the institution, is dead. It died in 1968, killed by the arithmetic it had always served. Closed because the private industry it had taught to manufacture could finally do the job more cheaply. Springfield Armory, the name is very much alive, thriving, profitable, stamped on hundreds of thousands of guns a year by a company that had nothing to do with building the reputation it sells. The thing that was built over 174 years and the thing that captured its value at the end are two different entities, and confusing them is the mistake. The company and the name are not the same asset. They never were. Consider what each rifle actually solved, one line each, because the decisions were the story. The Model 1795 solved the problem of depending on Europe for arms. Interchangeable parts solved the problem of a broken gun on a battlefield. The Model 1861 solved the problem of arming a whole nation to a single standard. The trapdoor solved the problem of modernizing without money. The Model 1903 solved the problem of falling behind the Mauser. The Garand solved the problem of the soldier who could only fire as fast as he could work a bolt. Each was a market problem answered by a manufacturing decision, and each decision carried a cost that the arsenal, in the end, paid. And consider the errors the same way, as decisions made once and paid for later. The choice to run the factory at wartime speed left brittle receivers that could maim the men who fired them. The choice to copy the Mauser too closely left the sovereign United States writing royalty checks to Germany. The choice to own every design meant the men who created the guns, Allen and Garand above all, were paid in salary while the value flowed to the treasury. And the deepest decision of all, to make rather than buy, the choice that built the whole institution in 1794, was reversed in 1968 by the same logic that had created it, once private industry had grown strong enough to make buying the cheaper path. The Armory lived by arithmetic, and it died by arithmetic. Nothing about the ending betrayed the institution. The ending was the institution's own first principle, finally pointed the other way. The name survived because the government had made it mean something precise. Springfield Armory did not stand for a company or a family or a fortune. It stood for the arms of the United States, for 174 years of muskets and rifles carried by American soldiers. And that meaning had been paid for in full, in public money and public blood, by the time the factory closed. Precision like that is rare, and it does not evaporate when a factory shuts down. It sits there, attached to the words, waiting. The government let the words go. Someone else understood what they were worth. If you want to understand how a name can outlive and out-earn the institution that spent 2 centuries making it valuable, how the thing that gets built and the thing that gets banked can come apart completely at the end, Springfield Armory is the case to study.